Every fantasy world has some sort of creation story or creation myth. So today let's talk about how yours and my world were created. Hey fellow Game Masters, I'm Richard Quiner and welcome back to the Daily D20, your daily dose of all things tabletop role-playing games helping you build your world and master your game. And today we're actually talking about building worlds or how worlds are built in a creation myth scenario, so let's get into that. From this point on in this video, I'm going to be referring to it as a creation myth. That's because often these kinds of stories are not a known fact, but are a story that's kind of passed down through generations, and it just kind of rolls off the tongue as the creation myth of your world. Now, I will note that the creation myth is not the most important aspect of building your fantasy world, but it can inform a lot of decisions further on, which is why it's something I wanted to tackle early on in building my world. One thing I did want to do is give you some permission. I know you don't need my permission, but some people like getting permission to do or not do things. So I'm going to tell you some stuff you could do and some stuff you don't have to do so you can feel more free to do whatever you want because it's your world. First off, you don't have to follow the natural scientific structuring that we know in our current world of planets and moons and solar systems and gravity. You don't have to follow any of that in building your fantasy world. A very well-known author, Terry Pratchett, built a whole universe based on a world that is the shape of a disc, that is carried on the back of 4 elephants, that are riding on the back of a gigantic turtle flying through outer space. You don't have to do that, but it's an option if you want. Something else you should know is you don't have to be 100% unique. If you think about it and you really like the idea of planets and solar systems, you're welcome to use those. No one's going to tell you not to. Plus, if trying to think of something truly unique and special is kind of draining your creativity, it's a good fallback to just say it's a planet in the solar system. It's fine. Something you should also know is you don't want to burn yourself out by trying to make the perfect world, so just come up with something quick and simple that makes a little bit of sense to you, and then you'll be fine. But that leads into the last set of permission is it doesn't have to make sense. This is a fantasy world. It doesn't have to make sense scientifically. It doesn't have to make sense in any sort of common idea. It can just be fun if that's what you want to do. So let yourself be free to create your world creation myth how you want it to be. Now, I had some thoughts when I'm coming up with the creation myth of my own world, and it's some things that tie into this current world. And there's the topic of science versus religion. Now, in the current world, there are 2 main classes of thoughts of how the world was created. There is the scientific method that talks about evolution. We go back to the Big Bang Theory when the universe was created and everything exploded out from a single point and created the world, and the gravity pulled things together, and then we all evolved from single-celled organisms. And then there's the creation myth that says God created the world in a certain amount of days, or that days could be, metaphorical days, it doesn't matter, but you have also the side of it where God created the earth and the solar system and the universe. And it's something when you're creating your creation myth that you should feel comfortable in writing it however you want. If you want your world to have been created by deities, then you can do that. If you want to give it a scientific explanation, even if that science isn't true science, if it's, just made up in your fantasy world science, that's perfectly fine too. You have that kind of freedom. I like looking at this because in our current world, we have all this disagreement. No one knows for sure how this world came about, but everyone has theories, everyone has ideas, everyone has kind of methods or beliefs that they hold, and that can happen in your world, and that's something I'm going to build into my world as well, is a difference of opinions. Different cultures will believe different things of how the world came about, and I think that's something to me is interesting, and I think that can add a lot of depth to my fantasy world. But of course, you have to make the choice for yourself. What do you feel like will make more sense for your world? Does your new world have magic? Because if it does, you might want to tie that into the creation and give some sort of explanation of where that magic comes from. It just kind of makes more sense when you have a source of magic. In some fantasy genres or books, they say the magic came from dragons. In others, it comes from certain powerful stones or artifacts that exist, that absorb different energies over the course of a millennium. That's one thing I have to think about, and something I suggest you do too, is where does the magic in your world come from? What are the sources? Is it a religious source of magic, based on deities and belief systems? Or is it a scientific source of magic, such as electricity and this kind of technology-based science, or magic as we can call it? What makes sense for your world? In my world, I'm currently giving it a situation where there isn't a lot of faith, there's not a lot of religious belief going on, so the magic is more of just a fact of life, it's more of a scientific thing that exists, and maybe the power comes from actual artifacts or materials that exist on the planet. If you make your creation myth and you decide to go with a religious-based route that has a creator or an omnipotent power, what is that power doing now? Think about that. So the believers of that power that is in your fantasy world have some reason that they may or may not talk to that god. Where did they go after they built the world? How come they're not there still with everyone else that they may have created? Think about that as aspects also of your creation myth story. Another thing that fascinates me about the creation myth and about fantasy and stories in general is it always comes down to a conflict between good and evil. And that source of evil is just as important as the source for good. If you look at Star Wars, there is the Jedi and the Sith. There's good and evil, and it comes from the Force has the two sides that it comes from. That's one way to look at it. Religions generally look at a super-powered devil-type creature, that all the evil in the world stems from them and their corruption of the people. Think about that for your world. Where does the evil come from? What is it that you want to make the source of evil so you can have some conflict built into your world? If you build a fantasy world and it's a utopia, that's fine. But for a story and a game and this kind of world that is built around conflict, having no evil means there's less conflict just built into the innate world. That's why I like the idea of there is good, there is evil. You have to have one to have the other. A built-in conflict that no matter how the players are, there is still always going to be this story in the world that will be found. If your world does have a devil creature or a being that is the source of the evil in the world, how did they become that? What caused them to be the source of all evil? Think about that. Also, add it to your story. Do you have to write it right away? No, but it's something to think about as you're building your creation myth. And the last thing I want you to think about is ask yourself, when will you finish your creation myth? And really, you could ask this over and over again. When is your creation myth going to be done? And I kind of look at it as never. As long as I am building this world, the creation myth will still be in a state of flux. Until I publish it, I will never be finished with the creation myth. And even after I publish the world, that creation myth could still change if I decide to add supplements or add more onto the campaign setting. It can be in a constant state of flux, so I never have to feel the pressure that I have to get it perfect right away, because it can change and flow as I build more onto the world. So think about that as well. You don't have to get it right the first time. You can add on to it later, and that's perfectly acceptable. So right now, as I'd mentioned, I was going to tell you what I'm working on. This is what I am working on right now. For Yndir, I am working on a creation myth or two. I want to have several that different cultures can believe in this world. So it's a work in progress. I thought about talking about this today because it's where my mind is at for my world, but I will actually say I'm not quite there yet. I will update the description and leave a write-up of my world's creation myth. Maybe I'll make another video about my world's creation myth once I have something solid that I actually like. But for now, I just wanted to share my thoughts, kind of where my head is at with building this creation myth for Yndir, to give you some insight on what you might think about when building your own creation myth for your world. If you like this video, go ahead and hit the like button and hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos every day. And of course, Game Masters, I've been Richard Quiner. Thank you for watching.